Hi, y'all. It's lovely to see everyone. I hope you've all had a great time so far, and welcome to Merging Flesh, Merging Hearts, Body Horror, and Intimacy in BL. I am your host, your ghost host. Sorry, went Haunted Mansion for a second, Phoebe, and today we'll be talking about the intersection of love and horror. Specifically, how boys' love's work sometimes use images that seem grotesque or disturbing to express intimacy, desire, and connection. So, before we go any further, I want to be clear about what this panel is about and what it's not. So, this panel is not here to indulge in shock for shock's sake, nor is it to revel in gore or sensationalism. Instead, we're going to look at body horror as a language, a way that stories talk about connection and emotional intensity. So, to get us started, I'd like for you all to ask yourself, what was the first time a piece of work made you feel both repelled and drawn in at the same time? Now, that mix of feelings is exactly what we'll be trying to understand today. And the main question we'll be exploring together is, why does BL sometimes frame love? Sorry, I forgot to switch slides. That was my bad. But why does BL? Ooh, that made me nervous. Sorry. Right. Why does BL sometimes frame love through imagery that should repulse us? Over the next hour, we'll start by first defining what we mean by body horror, how it works as a my God, symbolic system, and what are some reoccurring structural patterns that reappear across works. We'll then ground in to a psychological framework to help us understand what our bodies register when we look at these images. And lastly, we'll apply these tools to specific examples where these patterns show up very clearly. By the end of this panel, you should not feel like you have a final answer, but that you have more of a lens you can use to talk about why horror and passion are sometimes deeply interwoven. And with that in mind, let's begin by defining what body horror is, where it comes from, and how it works as an expressive language. So, uh, body horror is a subgenre of fiction that intentionally showcases grotesque and psychologically disturbing violations of the human body or of another creature. Depending on the author, it could be used both as shock or as symbolic destabilization of what the body is and what it means. Body horror often involves boundary collapsing, like human versus inhuman, and inside versus outside, self versus other. These breaks produce simultaneous feelings of disgust, terror, and fascination. I should also add an important distinction where gore doesn't automatically make something body horror. The genre hinges on the meaning of change rather than simple graphic content. Some more distinctions for anyone who may still be a little bit confused or need some clarity. Horror broadly covers fear, threat, and dread. The grotesque emphasizes deformation, distortion, and abnormal form. Body horror specifically uses the body itself as a site of threat and collapse. It can overlap with other forms of horror like psychological horror, but its defining feature is bodily violation and transformation that undermines the viewer's sense of physical integrity, right? So, not to get too much into the historical roots, but body horror goes back to early Gothic literature that played on the fear of corporeal instability. So, examples of such pieces of literature are Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. From there, it really thrived in Hollywood with films like Invasion of the Body Snatcher and The Thing, which established the body as a site of invasion and loss of control, along with The Fly, which primarily focused on mutation and visceral special effects. These established early tropes within the genre. The body horror genre is also widely represented throughout Japanese horror and within contemporary media. The 1988 film Akira is one of the early examples of body horror within anime. In more recent history, though, we're seeing a rise in films featuring body horror with Titan, Men, Infinity Pool, The Substance, Together, uh, being just a few releases in the past 5 years, with The Substance gaining critical acclaim and nomination in a number of categories across multiple award ceremonies. And this may not seem very impressive, but for a genre that was mostly quiet and only saw a few major releases a year, this resurgence is rather interesting. I mean, outside of mostly indie production companies, body horror didn't regularly make it to a place where I guess it was a household name, if that makes sense, at least outside of the horror community. Now, French, where are we right now? There we go. French psychoanalytic theorist Julia Kristeva developed the concept of objection in Posers of Horror, in which she states that objection is the experience of confronting what must be excluded from the self to maintain a stable identity. It occurs between the boundaries, such as the ones discussed earlier, being inside versus outside, life, death, and self/other. Our sense of self depends on excluding certain things, such as bodily waste, death, decay, in order to maintain psychological order. When the abject blurs these lines, it triggers a paradoxical reaction of revulsion and deep attention. The ambivalence is central to body horror, right? The viewer is not just scared, but compelled to look, to experience the breakdown of categories. Objection is tied to early identity formation processes, where the infant must separate from the maternal body, with people suggesting that the horror of the loss is echoed in later experiences of boundary collapse. In this way, body horror evokes deep psychological states around dependency, separation, and the fragility of self. Objection also operates at a cultural level. What society refuses is projected onto monstrous figures, like bodies that defy norms or forms that resist classification. Body horror can dramatize social anxieties about purity, normalcy, and the integrity of the self and community. Now, erotic horror is a category where sensual and sexual elements are intertwined with horror imagery to create excitement from tension between desire and repulsion. Erotic horror is not just about desire emerging where horror destabilizes the body. The overlap is central to what makes certain BL work containing body horror emotionally intense rather than purely traumatic. Eroguro, short for erotic grotesque, is a Japanese artistic tradition that explicitly merges eroticism with deformation, abnormality, and implausible bodily forms. Its origins lie in the early 20th century Japanese Eroguro nonsensu movement, which explored social deviance, corruption, and aesthetic extremes often linked to historical upheaval. It also became a visible aesthetic in literature, art, and early film. While Eroguro works treat the grotesque as an object of attention, curiosity, and sometimes desire, the distorted bodies and exaggerated fluids and forms and eroticism interwoven with imagery that would normally provoke disgust are argued by some scholars to be a response to cultural anxiety about sexuality, modernity, and propriety. Whereas Western body horror often isolates the grotesque as a threat, Eroguro ambivalently celebrates the collision of the erotic and grotesque. Bodies may be abnormal or violent, but their forms they aren't always framed as simply repulsive. This difference helps explain why some BL works can depict grotesque transformations as intimate rather than purely revolting. It positions the grotesque not just as other, but often as attractive in its excess. Now, horror dramatizes the dissolution of physical boundaries, while intimacy dissolves emotional or psychological boundaries. BL body horror fuses these experiences so that the destabilization of the body mirrors the destabilization of the self in love. Bringing this back to objection, it helps explain why these depictions that should repel can instead feel heavier with emotional intensity. So rather than fear, the pull comes from fascination with collapse and entanglement. And these mechanisms allow BL creators to frame the grotesque body as a metaphor for emotional fusion and obsession and the desire to become part of another. Now, we will be looking at structural patterns common within body horror. So just a quick view of the common patterns. They are incorporeal, possession, transformation, loving the non-human, and then, of course, internal versus external, which is a cross-cutting pattern that helps analyze all of the above. For incorporation in horror, it's basically when one body enters another, and usually by eating, absorbing, or internalizing. Now, classic body horror examples are parasitic infection, mass consumption, being digested, and merging through bodily fluids. And eating and absorbing are rather straightforward concepts, but internalizing could be a little tricky to grasp in this concept or context. Basically, it works the same way you would think internalizing does outside of body horror. It's when stuff like societal pressures, traumas, or fears are absorbed in a character's own flesh, transforming the abstract anxieties like aging, misogyny, or gender dysphoria into tangible things like physical decay, mutation, or violation. The substance is a really good recent example of societal standards of violation, as it shows how intense and internalized pressure to meet beauty standards and fear of age can lead to self-hatred and extreme self-mutilation. The example would be Demi Moore creating a new her. Overall, though, the core effect of incorporation is that the boundary of separation has collapsed, and the eaten becomes part of the eater, so to speak. Narratively, because incorporation literally eliminates separation between bodies, in horror, this rupture usually triggers disgust because it threatens the integrity or perceived integrity of self. The internalized other is no longer outside, it's no longer separate, hence the body being violated from within causes disgust to arise. However, because of the nature of how incorporation happens, it simultaneously also brings a type of fascination to it. Like the final erasure of distance kind of makes everything feel really intimate, causing a type of contrasting affective state of fear and fixation. Incorporation as a romantic metaphor can be seen in a few ways, but common language around romance uses eat or consume metaphors the most. So this would be something like, I could just eat you up, or let me devour you with kisses, or I want to taste you on my tongue, etc. Metaphorically speaking, to love is to make someone a part of you, to integrate them into your life so deeply they fit snugly inside of you. In BL body horror, literal eating becomes symbolic of emotional incorporation. Some subforms of incorporation are cannibalism, which is the consuming of flesh, parasitism, the symbiotic or hostile internal takeover, and digestive metaphor, which is the dissolution of one's separate boundaries into one substance. And although these three subforms are equal in importance, the one we use, or the one we see used more often as a metaphor for love, and my personal favorite of the three, is cannibalism. So, if you'd indulge me, I'd like to I'd like to dive in a little deeper into this subform. Cannibalism in narrative can symbolize the ultimate emotional interiority, right? Where love that leaves nothing external, where the beloved is no longer beside you, but within you. In some narratives, this is framed as possession, in others as communion, and in some, like the cake verse, as eroticization of internalization. And those were some big words for Elmo. Cannibalism is believed to violate one of the most universal human taboos, right? Cross-cultural research shows that disgust responses to cannibalism are rooted in survival logic, as eating one's own species carries a high risk of disease and moral repugnance. This taboo makes cannibalism shocking, and it also makes any symbolic act using it heavy with emotional gravity. Eating someone literally makes them a part of your body. This expresses internalization to the most literal degree possible. This overlaps with how people describe deep emotional connection, right? Like they're in my thoughts, or I carry them within me. In literary metaphors, or religious metaphors, though, as communion, like eating sacred elements to unite spiritually, and it resonates with the idea at a symbolic level. So, like, the act of eating the wafer and drinking the wine during Catholic Mass is literally ritualized cannibalism, granted a symbolic one and not literal, but still ritualized cannibalism nonetheless. In a romantic narrative, consuming another can symbolize total dedication. There's no distance left between lover and beloved. Consumption leaves no trace of separation. This resonates with phrases like, I want to devour you, or I'd eat you up. These expressions are metaphorical and frankly normal speech, at least for me, but are literalized in certain narratives. Cannibalism can also symbolize obsession or the desire to possess completely. Narratives can depict cannibalism as consensual communion or as a form of domination. This duality lets you explore how love and obsession overlap, and how the boundary between affection and control can blur in narrative terms. Writers sometimes use cannibalism as a way to express the intensity of attachment that transcends norms. This is especially true in contexts where characters are confronted with the choice of loving the other despite the horror, and not because of it. And in some works, there is mutual consent in internalization and emotional communion, while in others, the narrative frames it as coercion or violence. Part of figuring out in what way cannibalism is being used to symbolize love or obsession is to analyze how the act is framed and what that implies about the relationship at hand. Is it mutual surrender, or is one enacting a type of dominance over the other? An AU teaming with BL and cannibalism is the cake verse, a Korean-originated fanfic AU inspired by the Omegaverse, but instead of secondary gender designations surrounding heats, you get a predator-prey dynamic centered around taste. So per the Cake Verse's fanlore page, the trope is credited to have been created by a Korean Twitter user named Room Communicat back in 2016. And just like the Omegaverse, there are three types of individuals: cakes, forks, and normals, or also known as plates. Cakes are people who taste sweet, much like cakes. However, only a fork can taste their flavor. and their flavor can be tasted through flesh and bodily fluids, with each cake having a unique flavor to them. A person is able to live their entire life without knowing they are a cake. Forks can taste a cake's flavor by consuming their flesh or bodily fluids, and over time, usually around puberty, they lose their ability to taste anything other than a cake, causing cakes to become more irresistible. After finding a cake, a fork will be consumed with overwhelming desire to eat them, but will rarely resort to predatory behavior the first time they encounter a cake. Lastly, normals or plates are just those who exist without any of the characteristics of cake or fork. The fantasy of the cake first removes the horror of decay aspect typical of cannibalism and replaces it with eroticized consumption. Eating in the cake first, at least consensual eating, symbolizes pure internalization without disease or threat, complete devotion through edible surrender, and pleasure and disillusion of separation. Unconsensual eating, however, leans more towards obsession and possession, a kind of love that combines if I can't have you, no one else can, and I need every last bit of you to be mine. As a small side note, if any of you are in San Diego or will be visiting San Diego, California sometime in the future, the Museum of Us, located in Balboa Park, has an exhibit on cannibalism called Cannibalism, Myth, and Reality. I just recently went and it was actually really fun and very educational. And I learned that I, for my ailments, would need to have, I think it was bone dust, which was very interesting. So possession is when one entity inhabits the body of another, right? With the host's autonomy being compromised, but the original body persists. So classic horror examples of this would be something like demonic possession or a spirit haunting. The body remains whole on the outside, with the threat being inside and not really having a form, making the self layered rather than dissolved. Possession usually brings a type of anxiety about lost control and invasion of privacy. Viewers empathize with victims or victim hosts because autonomy is a core sense of self. Possession as a romantic metaphor, though, relies heavily on romantic attachment involving emotional inhibition, meaning someone knows your inner world. And lines that work with this concept are something like, I can't get you out of my head, or you have a piece of my heart. In body horror, this symbolism becomes literal, with one consciousness bleeding into another's internal world. And as a literary device, it dramatizes emotional permeability, meaning how much of myself can I lose and still be me. It also tests relational boundaries. Where does one self end and the other begin? It literally realizes the fear of pleasure, or realizes the fear and pleasure of being known completely. Subforms of possession are partial occupation, where the internal voice or presence guides from within. Dual consciousness, where two parties have a shared mental space, and coerced versus voluntary, which is just kind of simplifies down to, did the host consent? Now, the thing that separates classic exorcism horror versions of possession and like romantic possession is whether or not the act is mutual or consensual. Went too far, sorry. Transformation in horror is pretty straightforward. It's a physical change into something unfamiliar. The body becomes unstable, shifting form or species, with classical horror examples being werewolves, hybrids, and metamorphoses. Narratively, though, transformation often begins with a loss of self, and horror arises because the familiar body becomes unfamiliar. The stability of identity dissolves into an unpredictable form, and the emotional effects of transformation, at least as readers or viewers, are that it usually brings out a fear of losing oneself or anxiety about rejection from others, and possibly even disorientation from the transformation that seems unstoppable. As a romantic metaphor, though, transformation can be used as an example or exaggeration of how a romantic connection changes people irreversibly. When in love, you usually see a shift in priority and behavior and outlook. Things that once didn't matter now mean a lot, or vice versa. Things that you believed once mattered a lot now could mean nothing. So this this mutation externalizes interchange, showing literal alterations of the body by effective force. Now, subforms of transformation are gradual change, which is the incremental shift preserving traces of the former self, sudden metamorphoses, which are abrupt redefinitions of self, and of course, symbolic change, which is transformation catalyzed by relationships. Now, we tend to see the last one more in romance, but that doesn't stop the first two from appearing in work that include body horror within the romance genre. Now, something we kind of get to see in romantic body horror is love that's directed towards entities that are not human. This would be like ghosts, monsters, infected hosts, or constructed bodies, the usual. Non-humans automatically raise questions of identity and continuity, and what traits constitute love-worthiness. Much of the horror elements often emerge because the beloved is not fully predictable or relatable. And because they're unrelatable, this creates a bit of a cognitive dissonance, where you're kind of left there thinking, is this really love? It also adds a challenge of empathy. Can we empathize with someone defying human norms by loving the unknown? And does this create a type of intimacy paradox where closeness without shared humanity is still possible? Non-human love usually depicts loves that often defy rational categories, like people who fall for those who are, quote, not right for them, end quote, socially or biologically. But on a deeper level, non-human love could also mean loving the part of ourselves we can't categorize or are way too afraid to share with others. It expands the concept of intimacy beyond normative bodies and forces audiences to reconsider what love requires. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about when looking at the structural patterns is internal versus external differential. So, as you know, body horror often turns inside to outside, and it goes against normal bodily boundaries that often protect the self from contamination. If we were to take that literally, that would be our skin. But exposure of the internal produces anxiety because the interior is private and self-defining, right? Our organs should not be leaving our bodies. And if I'm going to be honest, organs in general kind of scare me, and I would rather they not be in my body in general, but that's a conversation for another day. And intimate emotional interiority is revealed gradually, but with body horror, it's exposed forcefully and often rapidly. This kind of creates a weird romantic double bind where love requires you to reveal yourself, but the horror as aspect of it all punishes you for or punishes exposure with violation. It doesn't allow you that slow burn. Instead, it thrusts you into a vulnerable state and often against your will. And because of this differential nature between the two, it shows how body horror can compress both the fear of risk of exposure and risk of never being seen. So these structural patterns help explain how body horror repurposes fear-based imagery into expressions of intimacy, possession, incorporation, and transformation, all mechanisms through which narrative dramatizes the psychological experiences of love as boundary dissolution. We now get into the psychology and effect of it all. So there's a reason why horror and desire can feel intertwined in human psychology. And that's because there's this weird thing where both the fear of bodily harm and arousal can share responses in the brain and body, right? So take disgust, for example. Disgust evolved to protect organisms from disease and contagion. It triggers withdrawal from bodily fluids and decay that signal pathogen risk. And there are some examples from research in which disgust responses are strongest to stimulus associated with contamination, like rotting food, bodily fluids, and parasites, often causing bodily reactions such as jerking back, nausea, and cognitive avoidance. Fear is also an evolutionary trait, although one that is more learned than inherently born with. Fear arises when there is a perception of a threat. It triggers fight or flight psychology states, which usually involves increased heart rate and adrenaline release that aid in preparing the organism to anticipate danger. So basically, fear is a high arousal state that mobilizes attention and physical readiness. Body horror often conflates disgust with fear, and this produces an intense sympathetic activation in which the same system that's involved in emotional arousal is activated. Fear and sexual arousal activation also share similar psychological systems, right? They both have elevated heart rate, increased blood flow, sensory focus, and cortical attention bias towards the source of stimulant or stimulation. And research in affective neuroscience shows that the physiological states can be subjective in interpreting subjectively interpreted differently depending on the context. So, classic psychology findings show that people may misattribute an arousal response from one stimulus to another concurrent stimulus in a way that affects emotional labeling. Basically, that just means that you are feeling one thing, but because you're being exposed to another, you are now associating the other thing with what you are currently experiencing or feeling. An example study would be that male participants were asked to cross either a high shaky suspension bridge, which was believed to induce fear arousal in the brain, or a low sturdy bridge. Now, regardless of the bridge chosen, an attractive female interviewer would be waiting for them on the other side to ask them questions and provide her phone number for a follow-up. What was discovered was that the men who crossed the scary bridge were significantly more likely to call the female interviewer later, as well as their questionnaires also containing more sexual content compared to those who crossed the safe bridge. So, with that in mind, body horror can amplify sexual or emotional tension because the reader's nervous system is already really activated. Now, attachment theory also explains that humans have a natural drive to connect and seek closeness and maintain proximity to significant others. Safe attachment can override avoidance impulses, and in real life, people care for sick or injured loved ones even when the body looks and smells kind of unpleasant. Love can also reduce avoidance responses because attachment prioritizes closeness over threat avoidance. And with fiction creates a psychological buffer in which audiences know that the threat is simulated and not real. This allows exploration of fear and disgust without real danger, enabling curiosity and emotional engagement rather than pure avoidance. In real life, boundary violation is threatening, which makes fiction feel more like a contained puzzle where readers can approach psychologically risky content more easily. And narrative also gives structure and meaning. With mixed signals being fear and desire, it creates an emotional complexity. And this complexity can feel more intense or memorable than just simple pleasure or simple fear, right? Ambiguity breeds intensity. So, with horror fiction creating narrative tension and body horror producing physical revulsion and psychological fascination simultaneously, the tension elevates emotional stakes and works with fear and desire, intertwined. And I know I've already gone over this, but I'd like to restate that romance and erotic experiences often metaphorically involve melting boundaries with body horror, right? Making these metaphors literal. The threatening body is attached to the beloved. The fear becomes rational and not isolating. The nervous system may code threat plus affection as just intense attraction. This could also allow body horror within the romance genre to reassign meaning to bodily signals that typically would not be positive in nature. Now, for the juicy bit. Using all the stuff I just rambled about, we're going to look at two works, The Summer Hikaru Died and MADK, and see how everything works in action. Though, before all that, I would like to add some disclaimer. Only one of these manga have been adopted into an anime, and even then, it's only the first season. So for that reason, I'm going to try to keep all information that is learned later on in the series a secret so that the anime-only watchers don't get spoiled. As for the other work, MADK, it's published, and I've decided that it's relatively fair game with the exception to major spoilers. Everyone consent to that? Yes? Okay. If for whatever reason, though, you feel like you don't want to risk any spoilers, now would be the time to leave, but please know that I will miss you. I will miss you very much. Okay, starting off strong, The Summer Hikaru Died is a psychological horror mystery manga that follows the story of Yoshiki, who discovers that his best friend, Hikaru, has died, and his body is now possessed by an unknown entity, forcing him to navigate their changing relationship as he also simultaneously processes his grief. For slight clarification, this is not a traditional possession or transformation situation. The horror here is in ontological uncertainty, as Hikaru's body seems familiar, but the interior is unknown. Now, thinking back to all the structural patterns we went over, yes, I know there was a lot, which do you think apply to this story? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about it. Right, so loving the non-human, possession, and inside versus outside. So even though these are pretty straightforward, let's break them down a tiny bit more so we're all on the same page. Ooh, that was weird. Loving the non-human is probably the easiest to get, as the entity is not human, despite appearing like one, meaning that this embodies the pattern where the beloved defies human category, right? The question now, though, is Yoshiki's love for this Hikaru supposed to be a normal tale of loving something that is different? Or is it supposed to represent an internal battle that Yoshiki is experiencing in which he must learn to love himself? Possession is a little unique here, as I just mentioned, although it is still technically possession. It is possession without clear ownership, right? The entity occupies the body of someone Yoshiki loved, but doesn't have the same consciousness. This creates a cool and tricky kind of layered identity dynamic as we figure out what exactly this entity has possession over. Is it just Hikaru's body? Is it his memory, his spirit? We don't even know what this entity wants or their goals or motives, but we do, however, learn pretty early that they have in fact, all of Hikaru's memories. Which brings us to the inside versus outside. The horror of Hikaru still being alive, but not alive, comes from his internal ambiguity. His body is familiar enough to where he's able to trick people in the town that he's, the real Hikaru, but Yoshiki loved and knew his friend enough to see the subtle differences between this thing and the real Hikaru. Narratively, Yoshiki knows that this thing is not Hikaru, and by still choosing to stay creates an emotional tension between the two. There's such a grief that Yoshiki carries from the loss of his best friend, and just the thought of having this non-Hikaru around is better than not having Hikaru at all. And in the process of him slowly dealing with his grief using the pseudo Hikaru, the boys begin to explore aspects of themselves they weren't very aware of. So one of my favorite scenes is when we get to see both boys have this moment where they get to enter the other, right? So in a gym storage room, Yoshiki is seen putting his arm literally into Hikaru's chest, much to Hikaru's pleasure, and wiggling his fingers around as he tries to understand the sensations he's experiencing. In another scene, Hikaru has Yoshiki pinned to the floor, and he kind of allows his gooey looking form, or essence, not sure what you want to call that, but he starts entering Yoshiki's mouth and nose, completely suffocating him in the process. Both times, the boys felt like it was gross and weird, but it still felt kind of confusingly good. The first scene was more consensual than that of the second, but could be interpreted as a metaphor for physical intimacy, like the intensity and all-consuming feeling of first-time sexual encounters, where they're kind of awkward, a little confusing, and just a bit overwhelming. In fact, when asked about if there's a deeper meaning behind moments in which horror blends with eroticism between the boys in an interview, the mangaka, Mokuren, I hope I pronounced that right, responded with, "I drew the scene where Yoshiki puts his hand inside Hikaru's stomach, thinking some people would find it erotic, while others would find it disgusting and uncomfortable. Both feelings are correct and are exactly what the protagonist Yoshiki is feeling. I want people's feelings towards the unknown to not only be scary, but also sometimes sexual, sometimes unpleasant, and very complex. In reality, the more we find it difficult to accept something, the more sexualized and frightening it is and awakens something primal in us." In a separate part of that same interview, they said that although Yoshiki isn't particularly an unfortunate character, he's a protagonist with problems that can be found anywhere, and Yoshiki faces the monster called Hikaru, he must also face himself. So it looks like, at least when it comes down to the possession, the loving of a non-human entity structured pattern, that Yoshiki is supposed to, in some way, find a way to love himself, or at least get himself to a place where he is satisfied being who he is. Getting a little more twisted, MADK is a dark fantasy horror following a high schooler named Mokoto who summons a demon in order to live out his kink of eating someone alive in exchange for his life. So to those who have read this manga, what structural patterns do you think apply to this story? Give you a few seconds. And for everyone who thought of transformation, incorporation, and of course, loving the non-human, you are correct. In the beginning of the series, we see that Jay, the demon summoned, gives Mokoto a new body, kind of symbolizing a rebirth of sorts. And ushering Makoto into the demon world. Makoto later takes control of this form and starts redesigning himself further, right? In a internal fixation kind of way. And with the way Makoto's transformation is depicted as the story continues, it's made clear that it's the type that falls under love changes you, but in a prideful, obsessive, and competitive kind of way, as the self-surgeries that he puts himself through are in pursuit of dominance and proximity to Jay. It's Makoto's way of rebuilding himself to become worthy of confronting or surpassing Jay. His body thus becomes a tool for obsession and is continuously being sculpted in service of fixation. Now, the incorporation aspect of the relationship between the two are also brought on by Makoto's obsession, right? And not to spoil too much, but at some point, Makoto decides that emotional reciprocity doesn't really matter to him anymore. What does matter is possession of Jay's attention and significance. He insists that no one understands Jay the way that he does, and it reveals a classic obsession marker that the belief in singular, irreplaceable insight. This kind of culminated into Makoto expressing that he needs to devour Jay completely in a way that annihilates and surpasses and internalizes him. It's here that Makoto's obsession starts reframing intimacy as consumption, and love begins to become indistinguishable from domination. That said, Makoto still wishes to receive Jay's love and praise. He can't imagine a world without Jay, and desires nothing more than to eat and taste him for all of eternity. The relationship is built on agendas, ambition, and ego, yet Makoto's obsession seems to produce a twisted type of devotion. Every action he does circles right back to Jay, causing his identity to narrow around that singular object. In a way, as his body continues to transform, so does the scope of himself. In the end, Makoto frames internalization as a final union and display of dominance over Jay. Instead of caring about how Jay feels for him, he simply wanted permanence. I can't say any more because I would be giving the end away, but know that the cannibalistic metaphor of devouring the one you love as a way of forever making them a part of you fails physically, but succeeds emotionally, kind of representing the limits of control and love. So if devouring is framed not as communion but as ultimate dominance, the desire to internalize the beloved is indistinguishable from the desire to overpower them, and that is where obsession lies. Now, in conclusion, we've walked through the theory, patterns, psychological mechanisms, and narrative examples. We began with the question of why does BL sometimes frame love through imagery that should repulse us? We now see that we're looking at language of boundaries, and how love dissolves it and how horror dramatizes it. We defined body horror as an instability of the body that blurs inside and outside, self and other. We saw how the instability resonates with emotional boundaries in relationships and structure that literally expresses what happens when two people lose rigid psychological separation. We've explored patterns that, like incorporation, where internalization becomes a metaphor for union, possession, where interiority is shared and invaded, transformation, where love changes the self irreversibly, and non-human attachment, where love reaches beyond what we usually think as normal objective choice. We then connected these narrative tools to psychological and affective mechanisms, showing why fear and desire can sometimes feel like they belong together. And finally, in our case studies, we saw how these mechanisms play out in works. In the summary, Hikaru died, we saw attachment persisting despite uncertainty about identity, And in MADK, we saw obsession that almost annihilates the self because the object of fixation becomes central to the protagonist's being. And in our discussion of cannibalism as a metaphor, we saw how even the most extreme boundary dissolution can be read as symbolic expressions of internalization, communion, and devotion. This brings us back to our main takeaway. When BL uses body horror to express intimacy, it is not using horror as decoration, but as an expression of emotional boundary collapse, the very thing that love itself asks of us. Culturally, we tend to think of love as something soft, warm, and comforting. But when you look closely at how relationships feel inside the body and the nervous system, how much of ourselves we give up and how close we allow another person to come, it becomes clear that love and fear aren't always opposites. Sometimes they live in the same nervous system and occupy the same narrative. If there's one thing you take away from this panel, I hope that it's this. Horror in BL is not an enemy of love, but one of love's languages. And by learning that language, we learn something deeper about how stories and perhaps our own imagination navigate the tension between closeness and loss and self and other. To that, I then say, thank you all again for joining, and I hope you leave this panel with not just new examples, but new questions you can bring to the stories you love. And please, for the love of God, make sure you eat and stay hydrated. And enjoy the rest of the con.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Noodlefish. It was amazing. Everyone was raving about that. We have a Q&A now. I will be helping with the Q&A. We got about 7 minutes. Or am I counting wrong?
No, you're about right. 7
minutes. Yeah. My brain blue screen. So if anybody has any questions, all you're getting is compliments, Noodlefish.
Oh, thank you.
I agree.
I'm so nervous.
This was amazing. Oh, what is your favorite body horror boys love?
Oh, honestly, it really is MADK. I think the art style is some of the most beautiful and entrancing I have ever seen. The mangaka probably made a deal with the devil, because I genuinely don't know how someone can make art that beautiful. That said, I just recently finished one last night. It's very light on the body horror. It's called Sleeping Dead. It'll have an English release by Seven Seas, actually later this year, I think December 6th. God, it was beautiful. It deals with love and loss and rediscovering identity. Really pretty. Oh, and hot zombie man. So that's fun.
What other books would you suggest for boys love body horror?
Ooh, that's a great question. If I'm being honest, I couldn't find a lot, which is really, really weird. I guess it would have to depend on how much body horror are you looking for. And
I've got a whole bunch.
Do you?
Yeah.
Please share.
Anything by Gretchen Felker Martin. I've got one I just finished reading, The Woods All Dark by... Wait, let me see if I can see it. 1 second. Oh my goodness. The Woods All Black by Lee Mandello. I just finished reading it. Definitely got body horror in it, and it's definitely... it's actually trans. It's trans queer Appalachian horror. Really good short story. Not all that big.
Yeah, I think I'm going to, if it's cool with you, I'd love to either PM you for like a whole list and then I could put it in the discussion board, or you can add it after, whenever you're free.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll add a whole bunch of them. Most of them are trans horror, but it's all really good, gross body horror, very visceral.
All good things, all good things.
So, what got you into this topic, Noodlefish?
Me? Oh, I had just watched, I forgot what movie it was. It was definitely body horror, and it was by A24. I had just watched it with my sister, and it had to do with cannibalism, which I, again, genuinely love. Uh, and it got us having the conversation of cannibalism as a metaphor for love. And that mostly comes from the fact that every time my sister and I are hiking, and even though I have snacks in my backpack, I always tell her that I'm going to eat her because one, I'm losing calories, and two, I love her so much that I don't want nature to take her. So I guess it was just me being a little freak.
Good. We should all be little freaks. This question is interesting. How would you say this ties into Yu-Gi-Oh ships?
Oh, as in Yu-Gi-Oh battle monsters?
I think Yu-Gi-Oh as in the people with their decks, and they do
Yeah.
There's possession in there. There's possession in there. There's
Yes,
possession.
with Yugi, and then again with Merrick. Oh,
I didn't think about that. That C is right. That does tie into some Yu-Gi-Oh ships very nicely.
it does. Now, does anyone actually know any Yugi and Merrick fanfic? Because now I'm really interested. And if so, do they get possessed midway through? Because that would also be fun.
Oh, that might be something that they could send you a message about, especially C. It seems like they are into that.
Right? But yeah, I don't know how that would generally fit into the fic. Again, other than possession. And it would depend on, so when they get possessed, it's usually a body possession, right? Like when Yami takes over, Yugi is still in the background in his head. He just has no control over his body. And but with Merrick, if I'm not mistaken, it's full body and consciousness, right? So it would cause some interesting dynamics for sure if we're thinking about it in romantic kind of ways. I feel like I said nothing while saying a lot at the same time. I am so sorry.
It does open up new doors, and it opens up some interesting things to think about in terms of like rewatching Yu-Gi-Oh, being like, didn't see it that way. What would your advice be for someone wanting to write body horror?
Go for it. Enjoy yourself. Don't pigeonhole yourself at all. Think of the most messed up thing you possibly can, and then ask yourself, can this get worse? And if the answer is yes, go for it. But at the end of the day, you should also ask yourself, what am I trying to say through this, through what I am doing, right? You always want to put some type of passion or meaning behind it. And if you want to go body horror for just shock, then that's cool too. But having deeper meanings to things leaves a lot of room for interpretation, at least for your readers, which could be very fun.
They're asking if the presentation is going to be available for them.
Yes, the presentation as well as my script, so you guys can see how many mistakes I made. I will be making the discussion board right after this. I've actually been awake for 27 hours because I procrastinated making this.
Well, nobody can tell you did this last minute.
Thank you. Great. Don't tell me what to do, Satanas. sorry. I saw everyone telling me to
You
go to
do
sleep.
need, if they're saying that you need to sleep, you do need to sleep. For the
Fine.
social media, it's right there, the Tumblr. It shows the little icon, that's a Tumblr icon, and the Discord icon, and then her email, and then I believe that is that Reddit?
Yes, it is.
Reddit.
And
So that's all her social media.
yep, yes, it is. And just so you all know, I am a monster fucker researcher, so you guys may see a lot of monster fucker content. If that's not your thing, I'm sorry.
And
If
there
it
are more
is, party.
party. If there are more questions, I'm so sorry we missed them. We are at our time, so I'm going to go ahead and stop things. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Noodlefish, thank you so much for your presentation. This was amazing.
Of course, and thank you all for having me. Have a great day, guys. Enjoy the con.